The inside of a tent roof had to be the most boring sight in the world. But lying back in his shirt sleeves on scarlet-tasseled cushions that Malindra had acquired, Matt studied the gray-brown cloth intently. Or rather, he stared beyond it. One arm curled behind his head, he swirled a hammered silver goblet full of good wine from the south of Cairhien. A small cask had cost him as much as 2 good horses would. As much as 2 horses would have if the world and everything in it had not been stood on its head. But he counted it a small price for something decent. Sometimes a drop or 2 splashed over onto his hand, but he never noticed, and he never took a drink. By his book, matters had long since gone beyond merely serious. Serious was being stuck in the waist with no idea of the way out. Serious was dark friends popping up when you least expected, Trolloc attacks in the night, the odd murderer freezing your blood with an eyeless stare. That sort of thing came quickly and usually was done before you had much chance to think. It was certainly not what you would seek out, yet if you had to, you could live with it, if you could live through it. But for days he had known where they were heading and why. Nothing quick about it. Days to think. I am no bloody hero, he thought grimly, and I'm no bloody soldier. Fiercely, he pushed down a memory of walking fortress walls, ordering his last reserves to where another crop of Trolloc scaling ladders had sprung up. That was not me. The light burn whoever it was. He did not know what he was. A sour thought. But whatever he was, it involved gambling in taverns, women, and dancing. That he was sure of. It involved a good horse and every road in the world to choose from, not sitting and waiting for somebody to shoot arrows at him or try to stick a sword or a spear through his ribs. Any different would make him a fool, and he would not be that. Not for Rand or Moraine or anybody else. As he sat up, the silver fox-head medallion, hanging on its leather thong, slipped from the unlaced neck of his shirt. He tucked it back before taking a long swallow of wine. The medallion made him safe from Moraine or any other Aes Sedai, as long as they did not get it away from him. Surely one or another would try sooner or later. But nothing except his own wits kept him safe from some fool killing him, along with a few thousand other fools. Or from Rand, or from being ta'veren. A man ought to be able to find a profit in something like that, having events twist themselves around him. Rand certainly had, in a way. He himself had never noticed anything twisting around him, except the fall of dice. He would not turn away from some of the things that happened to ta'veren in stories. Wealth and fame dropped into their pockets as if from the sky. Men who wanted to kill them decided to follow instead. And women with ice in their eyes decided to melt. Not that he was complaining at what he had, really. And certainly not that he wanted anything like Rand's bargain. The price to get into the game was too high. It was just that he seemed to be stuck with all the burdens of being ta'veren and none of the pleasure. It is time to go, he told the empty tent, then paused thoughtfully and sipped at the goblet. It is time to get on Pips and ride. Ride to Cairhien, maybe. Not a bad city, so long as he avoided the royal palace. Or Lugard. He had heard rumors about Lugard. A fine place, that, for the likes of him. Time to leave Rand in my dust. He's got a bloody Aiel army and more maidens than he can count taking care of him. He doesn't need me. That last was not strictly true. In some strange way, he was tied to Rand's success or failure in Tarmangaden. Him and Perrin both. 3 ta'veren all tangled together. The histories would probably only mention Rand. Small chance he or Perrin would find any place in the stories. And then there was the Horn of Valir, which he did not want to think about and would not. Not until he had to. There might be some way out of that particular mess yet. Any way he looked at it, the Horn was a problem for another day. A distant day. With luck, all those bills would come due on a very distant day. Only, that might take more luck than he had. The point now was that he had said all of that about going and felt scarcely a twinge. Not long ago, he had been unable even to speak of leaving. When he got too far from Rand, he had been drawn back like a hooked fish on some invisible line. Then he had become able to say it, even to lay plans, but the slightest thing would distract him, make him put off his schemes for stealing away. Even in Rhuidean, when he had told Rand he was going, he had been sure something would get in the way. It had, in a manner of speaking. Matt had made it out of the waste, but he was no further from Rand than before. This time, he did not think he would be diverted. "Not like I'm abandoning him," he muttered. "If he can't bloody take care of himself by now, he'll never be able to. I'm not his bloody nursemaid." Draining the goblet, he scrambled into his green coat, settled his knives in their hiding places, arranged a dark yellow silk scarf to hide the hanging scar on his throat, then snatched up his hat and ducked out. Heat hit him in the face after the relatively cool shade inside. He was not sure how the seasons changed here, but summer was hanging on too long to suit him. One thing he had looked forward to on leaving the waste was the arrival of autumn. A little coolness. No luck here. At least the hat's wide brim kept the sun off. This hilly Cairhien forest was a pitiful thing. More clearings than trees, and half of them going brown in the drought. Not a patch on the westwood back home. Low Aiel tents were everywhere, though at a distance they took on the look of a pile of dead leaves or a bare hummock of ground, unless the side flaps were up, and even then they were not easy to see. The Aiel going about their business did not look at him twice. From one crest as he crossed the encampment, he caught sight of Kadir's wagons, all in a circle, the drivers lying in the shade underneath, and the peddler nowhere in view. Kadir kept to his wagon more and more, seldom poking his nose out except when Moraine came to inspect the ladings. The Aiel ringing the wagons, small knots with spears and bucklers, bows and quivers, made little pretense of being anything but guards. Moraine must think Kadir or some of his men would try to make off with what she had brought out of Rhuidean. Matt wondered whether Rand realized that he was giving her anything and everything she asked. For a while, Matt had thought Rand had gotten the upper hand there, but he was not so sure any longer, even if Moraine did do everything but curtsy and fetch Rand's pipe. Rand's tent was on a hilltop by itself, naturally, that red banner on his staff at its front. It rippled in a light breeze, sometimes standing out enough to show the black and white disc. The thing made Matt's skin crawl as much as the dragon banner had. If a man wanted to avoid Aes Sedai entanglements, as any but an idiot would, the last thing to do was wave that symbol about. The slopes of the hill were bare, but maidens' tents encircled the foot of the hill and spread through the trees, up surrounding slopes, and down the other side. That was as usual, too, and so was the Wise One's camp within the Farderais Mai, dozens of low tents in shouting distance of Rand's Hill, with white-robed Gaishain bustling about. There were only a few of the Wise Ones to be seen, yet they made up for lack of numbers with the stairs that followed him. He had no idea how many could channel in that bunch, but they were a fair equal of Aes Sedai, weighing and measuring, when it came to stairs. He picked up his pace, making an effort not to shrug uncomfortably. He could feel those eyes on his back as surely as he could have a poke from a stick. And he would have to run the same gauntlet coming out. Well, a few words with Rand, and it would be the last time he had to run it. Only, when he pulled off his hat and ducked into Rand's tent, no one was there except Natail, lounging on the cushions with his gilded, dragon-carved harp propped against his knee, and a gold goblet in his hand. Matt grimaced and swore under his breath. He should have known as much. If Rand had been here, he would have had to pass through a circle of maidens right around the tent. Most likely he was up at that new-built tower. A good idea, that. Know the terrain. That was the second rule, close behind know your enemy, and not much to choose between them. The thought put a sour twist to his mouth. Those rules came from other men's memories. The only rules he wanted to remember were never kiss a girl whose brothers have knife scars, and never gamble without knowing a back way out. He almost wished those memories of other men were still separate lumps in his brain, instead of oozing into his thoughts when he least expected. Trouble with a bilious stomach? Natal asked lazily. One of the wise ones might have a root to cure it. Or you could try Moraine. Matt could not like the man. He always seemed to be thinking of a joke he did not mean to share, and he always looked as if he had 3 servants taking care of his clothes. All that snowy lace at collar and cuffs, always seeming freshly laundered. The fellow never appeared to sweat, either. Why Rand wanted him around was a mystery. He almost never played anything merry on that harp. Will he be back soon? Natal shrugged. When he decides to. Perhaps soon, perhaps late. No man clocks the Lord Dragon. And few women. There it was again, that secretive smile. A touch bleak this time. I'll wait. He meant to go through with this. Too many times he had found himself putting off going. Natal sipped at his wine, studying him across the goblet's rim. It was bad enough that Moraine and the Wise Ones watched him in that silent, searching way. Sometimes Egwene did, too. She had certainly changed, half Wise One and half Aes Sedai. But from Rand's gleeman, it was enough to set his teeth on edge. The best thing about leaving would be not having anyone look at him as if they would know in a minute what he was thinking, and already knew whether his small clothes were clean. 2 maps lay spread out near the fire pit. One, copied in detail from a tattered map found in a half-burned town, covered northern Cairhien from west of the Alguenia, halfway to the spine of the world, while the other, newly drawn and sketchy, showed the land around the city. Slips of parchment held down with pebbles dotted both. If he was going to stay and ignore Natal's searching look at the same time, there was nothing for it but to study the maps. With the toe of his boot, he shifted a few pebbles on the map of the city so he could read what was written on the parchments. In spite of himself, he winced. If the Aiel scouts could count, Couladin had nearly 160,000 spears. Shaido and those who had supposedly gone to join their societies among the Shaido. A hard nut to crack, and prickly. This side of the spine of the world had not seen an army like that since Arthur Hawkwing's time. The second map showed the other clans that had crossed the Dragon Wall. All had now, in one force or another, strung out according to when they had left the Jangai and spread apart, but too close to here for comfort. The Shianda, the Kodara, the Darain, and the Miagoma. Between them, they apparently had at least as many spears as Couladin. They had not left many behind, if that was true. The 7 clans with Rand almost doubled that, easily enough to face Couladin or the 4 clans. Either or. Not both. Not at once. But both at once might be what Rand had to fight. What the Aiel called the bleakness had to be affecting those clans too. Every day still, men tossed down their weapons and vanished. But only a fool would think it lessened their numbers any more than it did Rand's. And there was always the possibility that some of those were going to Couladin. The Aiel did not speak of it very much or very freely, and masked the idea behind talk of joining societies. But even now, men and maidens decided they could not accept Rand or what he had told them of themselves. Every morning some were missing, and not all left their spears behind. A pretty situation, wouldn't you say? Matt's head jerked up at Land's voice, but the warder had entered the tent alone. Just something to look at while I waited. Is Rand coming back? He will be with us soon. Thumbs tucked behind his sword belt, Land stood beside Matt, looking down at the map. His face gave away as much as a statue's would. Tomorrow should bring the largest battle since Arthur Hawkwing. You don't say. Where was Rand? Still up on that tower, probably. Maybe he should go there. No. He could end up herring all over the camp, always one step behind. Rand would come here eventually. He wanted to talk about something besides Couladin. This fight is none of mine. I'm not running away from anything that concerns me in the least. What about them? He gestured to the slips representing the Miagoma and the others. Any word on whether they mean to join Rand? Or do they just intend to sit there watching? Who can say? Ruark doesn't seem to know any more than I do, and if the wise ones do, they are not telling. The only thing certain is that Couladin is not going anywhere. Couladin again. Matt shifted uncomfortably and took a half-step toward the entrance. No, he would wait. Fastening his gaze on the maps, he pretended to study them further. Perhaps Lan would leave him in silence. He just wanted to say his piece to Rand and go. The warder appeared to want to talk, though. What do you think, Master Gleeman? Should we rush down on Couladin with everything and crush him tomorrow? That sounds as good to me as any other plan, Natail replied dourly. Emptying the goblet down his throat, he dropped it on the carpets and picked up the harp to begin softly strumming something dark and funereal. I lead no armies, warder. I command nothing save myself, and not always that. Matt grunted, and Lan glanced at him before returning to his study of the maps. You do not think it a good plan? Why not? He said it so casually that Matt answered without thinking. 2 reasons. If you surround Couladin, trap him between you and the city, you might crush him against it. How long was Rand going to be? But you might push him right over the walls, too. From what I hear, he's nearly gotten over twice already, even without miners or siege engines, and the city is hanging on by its teeth. Say his piece and go. That was it. Press him enough, and you'll find yourself fighting inside Cairhien. Nasty thing, fighting in a city. And the idea is to save the place, not finish ruining it. Those slips laid out on the maps themselves, made it all so clear. Frowning, he squatted with his elbows on his knees. Lan got down with him, but he hardly noticed. A dicey problem, and fascinating. Best if you try to shove him away. Hit him from the south, mainly. He pointed to the River Galen. It joined the Alguenia some miles north of the city. There are bridges up here. Leave the Shaido a clear path to them. Always leave a way out unless you really want to find out how hard a man can fight when he's nothing to lose. His finger slid east. Wooded hills for the most part, it seemed. Probably not much different from right around here. A blocking force here on this side of the river will make sure they go for the bridges, if it's big enough and positioned right. Once they're moving, Couladin won't want to try fighting someone ahead of him while you're coming behind. Yes, almost exactly the same as at Genji. Not unless he's a complete fool, anyway. They might make it to the river in good order, but those bridges will choke them. I don't see Aiel swimming, or hunting fords out for that matter. Keep the pressure on, shove them across. With luck, you'll be able to harry them all the way to the mountains. It was like Quaindag fords, too, late in the Trolloc Wars, and on much the same scale. Not much different from the Torah Shan, either. Or Sulmine Gap, before Hawkwing found his stride. The names flickered through his head, the images of bloody fields forgotten, even by historians. Absorbed in the map as he was, they did not register as anything but his own remembrances. Too bad you don't have more cavalry. Light cavalry is best for the harrying. Bite at the flanks, keep them running, and never let them settle to fight. But Aiel should do almost as well. And the other reason? Lan asked quietly. Matt was caught up in it now. He more than merely liked gambling, and battle was a gamble to make dicing in taverns a thing for children and toothless invalids. Lives were the stake here, your own and other men's. Men who were not even there. Make the wrong wager, a foolish bet, and cities died, or whole nations. Natail's somber music was fit accompaniment. At the same time, this was a game that set the blood racing. Without lifting his eyes from the map, he snorted. You know as well as I. If even one of those 4 clans decides to side with Couladin, they'll take you from behind while your hands are still full of Shaido. Couladin will be the anvil, and they the hammer, with you the nut between. Only take half of what you have against Couladin. That makes it an even fight, but you'll have to settle for it. There was no such thing as fairness in war. You took your enemy from behind when he least expected it, when and where he was weakest. You still have an edge. He has to worry about a sortie from the city. The other half you split in 3 parts. One to funnel Couladin into the river, the other 2 a few miles apart, between the city and the 4 clans. Very neat, Lan said, nodding. That slab-carved face never changed, but approval touched his voice, if lightly. It would gain a clan nothing to attack either force, especially not when the other could take it in the rear. And none will try to interfere in what happens around the city for the same reason. Of course, all 4 could join. Not likely, if they haven't already. But if they do, everything changes. Matt laughed aloud. Everything always changes. The best plan lasts until the first arrow leaves the bow. This would be easy enough for a child to handle, except for Indirian, and the rest not knowing their own minds. If they all decide to go over to Couladin, you toss the dice and hope, because the Dark One's in the game for sure. At least you'll have enough strength clear of the city nearly to match them. Enough to hold them for the time you need. Abandon the idea of pursuing Couladin and turn everything on them as soon as he's well and truly begun crossing the Galen. But it's my bet they'll wait and watch, and come to you once Couladin is done for. Victory settles a lot of arguments in most men's heads. The music had stopped. Matt glanced at Natail and found the man holding his harp rigidly, staring at him over it harder than ever. Staring as if he had never seen him before, did not know what he was. The gleeman's eyes were dark polished glass, his knuckles white on the harp's gilding. With that, it all crashed home, what he had been saying, the memories he had been embracing. Burn you for a fool for not guarding your tongue. Why had Lan had to take the conversation that way? Why could he not have talked about horses or the weather, or just kept his mouth shut? The warder had never seemed all that eager to talk before. Usually the man made a tree seem talkative. Of course, he could have kept his own mind focused and his own mouth shut too. At least he had not been babbling in the old tongue. Blood and ashes, but I hope I wasn't. Springing to his feet, Matt turned to go and found Rand standing just inside the tent, absently twisting that odd bit of tasseled spear, as if he did not realize he was holding it. How long had he been there? It did not matter. Matt spilled it all out in a rush. I'm leaving, Rand. Come first light in the morning, I'm in the saddle and gone. I'd go this minute if I could get far enough in half a day to suit me for stopping. I mean to put as many miles between me and the Aiel, any Aiel, as pips can cover before I make camp. No point in bedding down close enough to be snapped up and hung out to dry by somebody's scouts. Couladin must have them out too, and even the others might not recognize him before he had a spear in his liver. I will be sorry to see you go, Rand said quietly. Don't try to talk me out of... Matt blinked. That's it? You'll be sorry to see me go? I've never tried to make you stay, Matt. Perrin went when he had to, and so can you. Matt opened his mouth, then closed it again. Rand had never tried to make him stay, true. He had just done it without trying. But there was not the slightest bit of Taviran tugging now, no vague feelings that he was doing the wrong thing. He was firm and clear in his purpose. Where will you go? South. Not that there was much choice of direction. The others led to the Galen, with nothing north of the river that he was interested in, or else to Aiel, one lot that would certainly kill him, and one that might or might not, depending on how close by Rand was and what they had had for supper the night before. Not good odds by his reckoning. To begin, anyway. Then somewhere there's a tavern, and some women who don't carry spears. Malindra. She might present a problem. He had the feeling she might be the sort of woman who did not let go until she wanted. Well, one way or another, he would deal with her. Maybe he could just ride out before she knew it. This isn't for me, Rand. I don't know anything about battles, and I don't want to know. He avoided looking at Lan and Natail. If either man cracked his teeth, he would punch him right in the mouth. Even the warder. You understand, don't you? Rand's nod could have been understanding. Maybe it was. I'd forget saying goodbye to Egwene, were I you. I'm no longer certain how much of what I tell her might as well be telling Moraine or the Wise Ones or both. I reached that conclusion a long time ago. She's left Emmons Field further behind than either of us, and regrets it less. Maybe, Rand said sadly. The light shine on you, Matt, he added, sticking out his hand, and send you smooth roads, fair weather, and pleasant company until we meet again. That would not be soon if Matt had his way. He felt a little sad about that, and a little foolish for feeling sad. Yet a man had to look after himself. When all was said and done, that was the long and short of it. Rand's grip was as hard as it had ever been. All that sword work had only added new calluses atop older bowmen's. But the ridged heron brand in his palm was distinct against Matt's hand. Just a little reminder in case he should forget the markings under his friend's coat sleeves, or those even stranger things inside his head that let him channel. If he could forget that Rand could channel, and he had not thought of it once in days, then it was far past time to be gone. A few more awkward words standing there. Lan seemed to ignore them, arms folded, silently studying the maps, while Natail had begun idly plucking his harp. Matt had an ear for music, and to him the unfamiliar tune had an ironic sound. He wondered why the fellow had chosen it. A few more moments, and Rand, half-stepping around, actually putting an end to it, and then Matt was outside. There was a crowd out there. A good 100 maidens spread about the hilltop, and walking on tiptoe they were so ready to spear somebody. All 7 clan chiefs waiting patient and still as stone. 3 Tyran lords trying to pretend they were not sweating, and the Aiel did not exist. He had heard about the lord's arrival, and had even gone to take a look at their camp, or camps. But there had been no one there he knew, and no one wanting to take a turn at dice or cards. These 3 eyed him up and down, frowning disdainfully, and apparently decided he was no better than the Aiel, which was to say not worth seeing. Clapping his hat on his head and pulling the brim low over his eyes, Matt studied the Tyrants coldly in return for a moment. He had the pleasure of seeing the younger pair at least become uncomfortably aware of him again before he started down the hill. The graybeard still looked all barely concealed impatience to enter Rand's tent, but it did not matter anyway. He would never see any of them again. He had no idea why he had not simply ignored them, except that his step was lighter and he felt full of vinegar. No wonder, really, leaving tomorrow at last. The dice seemed to be spinning in his head, and there was no knowing what pips would show when they landed. Odd, that. It must be Malindra worrying him. Yes. He would definitely leave early, and as quietly as a mouse tiptoeing on feathers. Whistling, he set off for his tent. What was the tune? Oh, yes. Dance with Jack of the Shadows. He had no intention of dancing with death, but it had a merry sound, so he whistled it anyway, as he tried to plan the best route away from Cairhien. Rand stood staring after Matt, long after the tent flaps had fallen to hide him. I only heard the last bit, he said finally. Was it all like that? Very nearly, Lan replied. With only a few minutes to study the maps, he laid out close to the battle plan that Ruark and the others made. He saw the difficulties and the dangers and how to meet them. He knows about miners and siege engines, and using light cavalry to harry a defeated foe. Rand looked at him. The warder showed no surprise, not the twitch of an eyelash. Of course, he was the one who had said Matt seemed surprisingly knowledgeable about military matters. And Lan was not going to ask the obvious question either, which was good. Rand had no right to give the little answer he had. Standing well back into what tree line there was on the crest, Matt held Pips's nose under his arm so the gelding would not whicker as he watched 1,000 or so Aiel slanting toward him across the hills from the south. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, stretching long rippling shadows to one side of the trotting mass. The night's warmth was already beginning to give way to the heat of day. The air would swelter once the sun reached any height. He was already beginning to sweat. The Aiel had not seen him yet, but he had few doubts that they would if he waited there much longer. It hardly mattered that they very nearly had to be Rand's men. If Couladin had men to the south, the day was going to get very interesting for those stupid enough to be in the middle of the fighting. Hardly mattered because he was not going to run the risk of letting them see him. He had already come too close to an arrow this morning for that kind of carelessness. Absently, he fingered the neat slice across the shoulder of his coat. Good shooting at a moving target only half seen through trees. He could have admired it more had he not been the target. Without taking his eyes from the approaching Aiel, he carefully backed Pips deeper into the sparse thicket. If they saw him and picked up their pace, he wanted to know. People said Aiel could run down a man on horseback, and he meant to have a good lead if they tried. Not until the trees hid them from him did he quicken his own step, leading Pips onto the reverse slope before mounting and turning west. A man could not be too careful if he wanted to stay alive on this day, on this ground. He muttered to himself as he rode, hat pulled low to shade his face, and black-hafted spear across his pommel. West. Again. The day had begun so well. A good 2 hours before first light, when Malindra had gone off to some meeting of the maidens. Thinking him asleep, she had not glanced at him as she stalked out, muttering half under her breath about Randall Thor and honor, and Farderai's Mai above all. She sounded as if she were arguing with herself, but frankly, he did not care whether she wanted to pickle Rand or stew him. Before she was a minute out of the tent, he was stuffing his saddlebags. No one had so much as looked at him twice while he saddled Pips and ghosted away to the south. A good beginning. Only he had not counted on columns of Tardad and Tomanel and every other bloody clan sweeping around to the south. No consolation that it was very close to what he had babbled to Lan. He wanted to go south, and those Aiel had forced him toward the Alguenya, toward where the fighting would be. A mile or two on, he cautiously turned Pips upslope, pausing deep in the scattered trees in the crest. It was a higher hill than most, and he had a good view. This time, there were no Aiel in sight, but the column winding along the bottom of the twisting hill valley was almost as bad. Mounted Tyrans had the lead behind a knot of colorful lords' banners, with a gap back to a thick, bristling snake of pikemen in the Tyrans' dust, and then another to the Cairhien horse, with their multitude of banners and pennants and con. The Cairhien maintained no order at all, milling about as lords shifted back and forth for conversation. But at least they had flankers out to either side. In any case, as soon as they were past, he had a clear route south. And I'll not stop until I'm halfway to the bloody Aranin. A flicker of movement caught his eye, well ahead of the column below. He would not have seen it except for being so high. None of the riders could have, certainly. Digging his small looking-glass from his saddlebags, Kintorvir liked the dice. He peered toward what he had seen and whistled softly through his teeth. Aiel, at least as many as the men in the valley, and if they were not Couladins, they meant to give a name-day surprise, for they were lying low among the dying bushes and dead leaves. For a moment he drummed fingers on his thigh. Shortly, there were going to be some corpses down there, and not many of them Aiel. None of my affair. I am out of this, out of here, and heading south. He would wait a bit, then head off while they were all too busy to notice. This fellow Wyraman, he had heard the Greybeard's name yesterday, was a stone fool. No foreguard out, and no scouts, or he'd know what was bloody in store for him. For that matter, the way the hills lay, the way the valley twisted, the Aiel could not see the column either, only its thin dust rising skyward. They certainly had had scouts to get themselves in place. They could not just be waiting there on the off chance. Idly whistling Dance with Jack of the Shadows, he put the looking-glass back to his eye and studied the hilltops. Yes, the Aiel commander had left a few men where they could signal a warning just before the column entered the killing ground. But even they could not possibly see anything yet. In a few minutes, the first Tyrans would come in sight, but until then... It came as a shock when he heeled Pips to a gallop downslope. What under the light am I doing? Well, he could not just stand by and let them all go to their deaths like geese to the knife. He would warn them. That was all. Tell what lay in wait ahead, then he was gone. The Cairhien and Outriders saw him coming before he reached the bottom of the slope, of course, heard Pips's dead-flat charge. 2 or 3 lowered their lances. Matt did not precisely enjoy having 1.5 feet of steel pointed at him, and still less 3 times over. But obviously one man was no threat, even riding like a madman. They let him pass, and he swung in near the lead Cairhien lords long enough to shout, "Halt here, now! By order of the Lord Dragon! Else he'll channel your head into your belly and feed you your own feet for breakfast." His heels dug in, and Pips sprang ahead. He only glanced back to be sure they were doing what he said. They were, if showing some confusion over it. The hills hid them from the Aiel still, and once their dust settled, the Aiel would have no way of knowing they were there. And then he was lying low over the gelding's neck, whipping Pips with his hat and galloping up alongside the infantry. If I wait to let Wireman pass the orders, it'll be too late, that's all. He would give his warning and go. The foot marched in blocks of 200 or so pikemen, with 1 mounted officer in front of each, and maybe 50 archers or crossbowmen at the rear. Most looked at him curiously as he dashed by, Pips's heels kicking up spurts of dust, but none broke stride. Some of the officers' mounts frisked as if the riders wanted to come see what had him in such a hurry, but none of them left their places either. Good discipline. They would need it. Defenders of the Stone brought up the tail end of the Tyrans, in their breastplates and puffy black and gold striped coat sleeves, plumes of various colors on the rimmed helmets marking officers and under-officers. The rest were armored the same, but bore the colors of various lords on their sleeves. The silk-coated lords themselves rode at the very front in ornate breastplates and large white plumes, their banners rippling behind them in a rising breeze toward the city. Reining around in front of them so quickly that Pips danced, Matt shouted, "Halt! In the name of the Lord Dragon!" It seemed the fastest way to stop them, but for a moment he thought they meant to ride right over him. Almost at the last moment, a young lord he remembered from outside Rand's tent flung up a hand, and then they were all drawing rein in a flurry of shouted orders that ran back along the column. Wireman was not there. Not a lord was as much as 10 years older than Matt. "What is the meaning of this?" demanded the fellow who had signaled. Dark eyes glared arrogantly down a sharp nose, chin lifted so his pointed beard looked ready to stab. Sweat trickling down his face spoiled it only a little. "The Lord Dragon himself gave me this command. Who are you to—" He cut off as another man Matt knew caught his sleeve, whispering urgently. Potato-faced Estion looked haggard beneath his helmet as well as hot. The Aiel had wrung him out concerning conditions in the city, so Matt had heard. But he had gambled at cards with Matt in Tyr. He knew exactly who Matt was. Estion's breastplate alone had chips in the ornate gilding. None of the others had done more than ride around looking pretty. Yet. Sharp-Nose's chin came down as he listened, and when Estion left off, he spoke in a more moderate tone. "No offense intended, Lord Matt. I am Melanril, of House Asegora. How may I serve the Lord Dragon?" Moderation slipped into actual hesitation at that last, and Estion broke in anxiously. "Why should we halt? I know the Lord Dragon told us to hold back, Matt, but burn my soul, there's no honor in sitting and letting the Aiel do all the fighting. Why should we be saddled with chasing them after they've broken? Besides, my father is in the city, and—" He trailed off under Matt's stare. Matt shook his head, fanning himself with his hat. The fools were not even where they should be. There was no chance of turning them back, either. If Melanril would go, and looking at him, Matt was not sure he would, even on supposed orders from the Lord Dragon, there was still no chance. He sat his saddle in plain sight of the Aiel lookouts. If the column started turning around, they would know themselves discovered, and very likely they would attack while the Tyrants and the Cairhien pike were tangled up. It would be a slaughter as surely as if they had gone ahead in ignorance. "Where is Wyraman?" "The Lord Dragon sent him back to Tyr," Malindra replied slowly, "to deal with the Ilianer pirates and the bandits on the plains of Marido. He was reluctant to go, of course, even for so great a responsibility, but... Pardon, Lord Matt, but if the Lord Dragon sent you, how is it that you don't know—" Matt cut him off. "I am no lord, and if you want to question what Rand lets people know, ask him." That set the fellow back. He was not about to question the Lord Bloody Dragon about anything. Wyraman was a fool, but at least he was old enough to have been in a battle. Except for Estion, looking like a sack of turnips tied on his horse, all this lot had seen was a tavern fight or two, and maybe a few duels. Fat lot of good that would do them. "Now you all listen to me. When you pass through that gap ahead, between the next two hills, Aiel are going to come down on you like an avalanche." He might as well have told them there was going to be a ball, with the women all sighing to meet a Tyran lordling. Eager grins broke out, and they started dancing their horses about, slapping each other on the shoulder and boasting how many they would kill. Estion was odd man out, just sighing and easing his sword in its scabbard. "Don't stare up there," Matt snapped. The fools. In a minute they would be calling the charge. "Keep your eyes on me! On me!" It was who he was friends with that settled them down. Malindra and the others in their fine, unmarked armor frowned impatiently, not understanding why he did not want to let them begin the business of killing Aiel savages. If he had not been Rand's friend, they probably would have trampled him and Pips both. He could not let them go charging off. They would do it piecemeal, leaving the pikes and the Cairhien horse behind, though the Cairhien might join in once they realized what was happening. And they would all die. The smart thing would be to let them get on with it while he headed in the opposite direction. The only trouble was that once these idiots let the Aiel know they were discovered, those Aiel might decide to do something fancy, like swinging around to take the strung-out fools in the flank. If that happened, there was no certainty that he would get clear. "What the Lord Dragon wants you to do," he told them, "is to ride ahead slowly, just as if there wasn't an Aiel inside 100 miles. As soon as the pikes are through the gap, they'll form a hollow square, and you get yourselves inside it double quick." "Inside?" Malindra protested. Angry mutters rose from the other young lords, except Estion, who looked thoughtful. "There is no honor in hiding behind stinking—" "You'll bloody do it!" Matt roared, reining Pips close to Malindra's horse. "Or if the bloody Aiel don't kill you, Rand will. And whatever he leaves, I'll chop into sausage myself." This was taking too long. The Aiel had to be wondering what they were talking about by now. "With any luck, you will be set before the Aiel can hit you. If you have horse bows, use them. Otherwise, hold tight. You'll get your bloody charge, and you'll know when. But if you move too early..." He could almost feel time running down. Setting the butt of his spear in his stirrup like a lance, he heeled Pips back down the column. When he glanced over his shoulder, Malindra and the others were talking and peering after him. At least they were not herring up the valley. The commander of the pikemen proved to be a pale, slender Cairhien, half a head shorter than Matt, and mounted on a gray gelding that looked past ready for the pasture. Derrid had hard eyes, though, an off-broken nose, and 3 white scars crisscrossing his face, one of them not very old. He took off his bell-shaped helmet while he talked with Matt. The front of his head was shaved. No lord, he. Maybe he had been part of the army before the Civil War started. Yes, his men knew how to form a hedgehog. He had not faced Aiel, but he had faced brigands and Andoran cavalry. There was an implication that he had fought other Cairhien as well, for one of the houses contesting for the throne. Derrid sounded neither eager nor reluctant. He sounded like a man with a job of work to do. The column stepped off as Matt turned Pips's head the other way. they marched with a measured pace, and a quick look behind showed the tyrant's horses moving no faster. He let Pips go a little quicker than a walk, but not much. It seemed he could feel Aiel eyes on his back, feel them wondering what he had said and where he was going now and why. Just a messenger who's delivered his message and is going away. Nothing to worry about. He certainly hoped that was what the Aiel thought, but his shoulders did not untense until he was sure they could no longer see him. The Cairhien were still waiting where he had left them. They still had their flankers out, too. Banners and Khan made a thicket where the lords had gathered, 1 in 10 or better of the Cairhien's number. Most of them wore plain breastplates, and where there was gilt or silverwork, it was battered, as though a drunken blacksmith had been at it. Some of their mounts made Darids look like Land's warhorse. Could they even do what was needed? But the faces that turned to him were hard, the gazes harder. He was in the clear now, hidden from the Aiel. He could ride on, after telling this lot what was expected of them anyway. He had sent the others on into the Aiel trap. He could not simply abandon them. Talmanis of House Delovinda, his Khan 3 yellow stars on blue, and his banner a black fox, was even shorter than Darid, and had 3 ears on Mat at most. But he led these Cairhien, although there were older men and even gray hair present. His eyes held as little expression as Darid's, and he looked like a coiled whip. His armor and sword were utterly plain. Once he had told Mat his name, the man listened quietly while Mat laid out his plan, leaning a little out of the saddle to cut lines in the ground with the sword-bladed spear. The other Cairhien lords gathered round on their horses, watching, but none so sharply as Talmanis. Talmanis studied the map he drew, and studied him from boots to hat, even his spear. When he was done, the fellow still did not speak until Mat barked, "Well, I don't care whether you take it or leave it, but your friends will be hip-deep in Aiel in not much longer." "The Tyrants are no friends of mine, and Darid is useful. Certainly not a friend." Dry chuckles ran through the onlooking lords at the suggestion. "But I will lead one half, if you lead the other." Talmanis pulled off one steel-backed gauntlet and put out his hand. But for a moment, Mat only stared at it. Lead? Him? I'm a gambler, not a soldier. A lover. Memories of battles long gone spun through his head, but he forced them down. All he had to do was ride on. But then maybe Talmanis would leave Estion and Darid and the rest to roast. On the spit, Mat had hung them from. Even so, it was a surprise to him when he grasped the other's hand and said, "You just be there when you're supposed to be." For reply, Talmanis began calling off names in a quick voice. Lords and lordlings reined toward Mat, each followed by a bannerman and perhaps a dozen retainers, until he had 400 odd of the Cairhien. Talmanis did not have much to say after either. He just led the remainder west at a trot, trailing a faint cloud of dust. "Keep together," Mat told his half. "Charge when I say charge, run when I say run, and don't make any noise you don't have to." There was the creak of saddles and the thud of hooves as they followed him, of course, but at least they did not talk or ask questions. A last glimpse on the other bristle of bright banners in Khan, and then a twist in the shallow valley hid them. How had he gotten into this? It had all started so simply. Just give warning and go. Each step after it seemed so small, so necessary. And now he had waded waist-deep into the mud and no choice but to keep on. He hoped Talmanis meant to show up. The man had not even asked who he was. The hill valley twisted and forked as he angled north, but he had a good sense of direction. For instance, he knew exactly which way lay south and safety, and it was not the way he was heading. Dark clouds were forming up there toward the city, the first he had seen so thick in a long time. Rain would break the drought, good for the farmers, if any remained, and settle the dust, good for horsemen, so they did not announce themselves too early. Maybe if it rained, the Aiel would give up and go home. The wind was beginning to pick up, too, bringing a little cool, for a wonder. The sound of fighting drifted over the crests, men shouting, men screaming. It had begun. Matt turned pips, raised his spear, and swung it right and left. He was almost surprised when the Cairhien formed into one long line to either side of him, facing upslope. The gesture had been instinctive from another time and place, but then these men had seen fighting. He started pips up through the scattered trees at a slow walk, and they kept pace to the quiet jangle of bridles. His first thought on reaching the height was relief at seeing Talmanis and his men coming into sight on the crest across from him. His second was to curse. Derrid had formed the hedgehog, spiny thickets of pikes 4 deep interspersed with bowmen to make a large hollow square. Long pikes made it difficult for the Shaido to get close, however they rushed in, and the archers and crossbowmen were exchanging shots hot and fast with the Aiel. Men were falling on both sides, but the pikes simply closed in when one of their number went down, making the square tighter. Of course, the Shaido did not appear to slacken their assault either. The defenders were dismounted in the center, and maybe half the tyrant lords with their retainers. Half. That was what made him want to curse. The rest dashed about among the Aiel, slashing and stabbing with sword and lance in knots of 5 or 10, or alone. Dozens of riderless horses told how well they were doing. Malindra was off with only his bannerman, laying about with his blade. 2 Aiel darted in to neatly hamstring the lordling's horse. It fell, head flailing. Matt was sure it screamed, but the din swallowed it. And then Malindra vanished behind cotton sore-clad figures, spears stabbing. The bannerman lasted a moment longer. Good riddance, Matt thought grimly. Standing in his stirrups, he raised the sword-bladed spear high, then swept it forward, shouting, "Los! Los Cabedrin!" He would have had the words back if he could, and not because they were old tongue. It was a boiling cauldron down in the valley. But whether or not any of the Cairhien understood a command of horsemen forward in the old tongue, they understood the gesture, especially when he dropped back into his saddle and dug in his heels. Not that he really wanted to, but he could not see any choice now. He had put those men down there. Some might have gotten away if he had told them to turn and run, and he just did not have a choice. Banners and con waving, the Cairhien charged downhill with him, shouting battle cries. In imitation of him, no doubt, though what he was shouting was blood and bloody ashes. Across the valley, Talmanis raced down just as hard. Sure that they had all the wetlanders penned, the Shaido never saw the others until crashed into from behind on both sides. It was then that the lightning began to fall, and after that, things really got hairy. Rain dripped from the brim of Matt's hat, and periodically he had to lower his looking glass and wipe off the end of the tube. The downpour had slackened in the last hour, but the sparse branches overhead gave no shelter at all. His coat was long since soaked, and Pips's ears were down. The horse stood, as if not intending to move however Matt thumped his heels. He did not know for sure what time of day it was. Somewhere in the middle of the afternoon, he thought. But the dark clouds had not thinned along with the rain, and they hid the sun where he was. On the other hand, it felt very much like 3 or 4 days since he had ridden down to warn the Tyrants. He was still not sure why he had done that. It was southward that he peered, and a way out that he looked for. A way out for 3,000 men. Easily that many survived yet, though they had no idea what he was up to. They believed he was hunting another fight for them. But 3 so far were 3 too many by his book. He thought he could have escaped on his own now, so long as he kept his eyes open and his wits about him. 3,000 men, however, drew eyes wherever they moved, and they did not move quickly, what with more than half their number afoot. That was why he was on this light-forsaken hilltop, and why the Tyrants and Cairhien were all jammed into the long, narrow hollow between this hill and the next. If he simply made a break for it... Jamming the looking-glass back to his eye, he glared south at sparsely wooded hills. Here and there were thickets, some fairly large, but most of the land was scrub or grass even here. He had worked back to the east, using every fold in the ground that would hide a mouse, bringing the column with him out of the treeless terrain and into some proper cover. Out of those bloody lightning strikes and fireballs. He was not sure whether it was worse when they came, or when the earth simply erupted in a roar for no apparent reason. All that effort to find that the battle was shifting with him. He could not seem to get out of the center of the thing. Where's my bloody luck now that I really need it? He was a pea-brained fool for staying. Just because he had managed to keep the others alive this long did not mean he could keep it up. Soon or late, the dice would come up the Dark One's eyes. They're the flaming soldiers. I should leave them to it and ride. But he kept searching, scanning the wooded peaks and ridges. They gave cover for Couladin's Aiel as well as for him, but here and there he could make them out. Not all were involved in pitched battles, but every last group was larger than his. Every one was between him and safety to the south, and he had no way to tell who was who until it might be too late. The Aiel themselves seemed to know at a glance, but that did him no good. Some mile or more off, a few hundred cotton-sore-clad shapes, running 8 abreast and heading east, topped a rise where half a dozen Leatherleaf made a poor excuse for a copse. Before the lead runners could start down the other side, a lightning bolt flashed down into their midst, splashing men and earth like a stone thrown into a pond. Pips did not even quiver as the clap reached Matt. The gelding had grown accustomed to closer strikes than that. Some of the fallen men picked themselves up, limping, and immediately joined those who had kept their feet in a hasty check of the unmoving. No more than a dozen were hauled across shoulders before they all dashed down from the height, back the way they had come. None paused to look at the crater. Matt had watched them learn that lesson. Waiting only invited a second silvery lance from the clouds. In moments, they were out of sight, except for the dead. He swung the looking-glass east. There was a look of sunlight a few miles that way. The log tower should have been visible, poking above the trees, but he had not been able to find it in some time. Maybe he was looking in the wrong places. It did not matter. The lightning had to be Rand's work, and all the rest of it as well. If I can get far enough that way... He would be right back where he started. Even if it was not the pull of Taviran drawing him back, he would have a hard time leaving again once Moraine found out. And there was Malindra to consider. He had never heard of a woman who would not take it askance when a man tried to walk out of her life without letting her know. As he panned the looking-glass slowly, hunting the tower, a slope covered in spaced leather-leaf and paper bark abruptly went up in flames. Every tree became a torch at the same instant. Slowly he lowered the brass-bound tube. He hardly required it to see the fire, and the thick gray smoke already making a thick plume into the sky. He did not need signs to recognize channeling when he saw it. Not like that. Had Rand finally tipped over the edge of madness? Or maybe Avienda had finally had enough of being forced to stay around him. Never upset a woman who could channel. That was a rule Matt seldom managed to follow, but he did try. Save the smart mouth for somebody besides yourself, he thought sourly. He was just trying not to think about the third alternative. If Rand had not finally gone mad, and Avienda or Egwene, or one of the wise ones, had not decided to be rid of him, then someone else was taking a hand in the day's business. He could add 2 2s without getting 5. Samael. So much for trying that way out. It was no way out of anything. Blood and bloody ashes. What has happened to my... A fallen branch cracked under someone's foot behind him. He reacted without thinking, knees more than reins pulling Pips in a tight circle, sword-bladed spear whipping across from the pommel of his saddle. Estian almost dropped his helmet, his eyes going wide, as the short blade stopped a breath short of splitting his head for him. The rain had slicked his hair down into his face. Also afoot, Nelicion grinned, partly startled and partly amused at the other young Tyran's discomfort. Square-faced and blocky, Nalisian was the second since Melanriel to lead the Tyrant cavalry. Talmanis and Derid were there as well, a pace behind as usual, and blank-faced beneath their bell-shaped helmets, also as usual. The four had left their horses farther back in the trees. "There are Aiel coming straight for us, Matt," Nalisian said as Matt raised the raven-marked spear upright. "The light burn my soul if there's one less than 5,000. He grinned at that, too. "I don't think they know we're here waiting for them." Estian nodded once. "They are keeping to the valleys and hollows, hiding from—" He glanced at the clouds and shivered. He was not the only one to be uneasy about what might come out of the sky. The other three looked up too. "Anyway, it's plain they mean to go through where Derid's men are." There was actually a touch of respect in his voice when he mentioned the pikes. Grudging, true, and not very strong, but it was difficult to look down on someone after they had saved your neck a few times. "They will be on top of us before they see us." "Wonderful," Matt breathed. "That is just bloody wonderful." He meant it for sarcasm, yet Nalisian and Estian missed the flavor, of course. They looked eager. But Derid wore as much expression on his scarred face as a rock, and Talmanis lifted an eyebrow at Matt just a fraction, shook his head a hair. That pair knew fighting. The first encounter with the Shaido had been an even wager at best, one Matt would never have taken if not forced. That all the lightning had shaken the Aiel enough to turn it into a rout changed nothing. Twice more today they had seen action, when Matt discovered himself in a choice of whether to catch or be caught, and neither had come out nearly as well as the Tyrants believed. One had been a draw, but only because he had been able to lose the Shaido after they pulled back to regroup. At least they had not come again while he was getting everyone away through the twisting hill valleys. He suspected they had found something else to occupy them. Maybe more of that lightning or fireballs or the light knew what. He knew very well what had allowed them to escape their last fight with skins mostly whole. Another bunch of Aiel plowing into the rear of those fighting him, just in time to keep the pikes from being overrun. The Shaido had decided to withdraw to the north, and the others, he still did not know who, had swung off to the west, leaving him in possession of the field. Nalisian and Estian considered it a clear victory. Derid and Talmanis knew better. "How long?" Matt asked. It was Talmanis who answered. "Half an hour, perhaps a little more, if grace favors us." The Tyrants looked doubtful. They still did not seem to realize how quickly Aiel could move. Matt had no such illusions. He had already studied the surrounding terrain. But he looked at it again and sighed. There was a very good view from this hill, and the only halfway decent stand of trees within half a mile was right where he sat his saddle. The rest was scrub brush, little as much as waist high, dotted with leatherleaf and paper bark and the occasional oak. Those Aiel would surely send scouts up here for a look, and there was no chance at all that even the horsemen could get out of sight before they did. The pikes would be right out in the open. He knew what had to be done. It was catch or be caught again. But he did not have to like it. He only took a glance, but before he could open his mouth, Derid said, "My scouts tell me Couladin himself is with this lot. At least their leader has his arms bare and shows marks such as the Lord Dragon is said to carry." Matt grunted. Couladin, and heading east. If there was any way to step aside, the fellow would run headlong into Rand. That might even be what he was after. Matt realized that he was smoldering, and it had nothing to do with Couladin wanting to kill Rand. The Shaido chief, or whatever the man was, might remember Matt vaguely as somebody hanging about Rand, but Couladin was the reason he was stuck out here in the middle of a battle, trying to stay alive, wondering whether any minute it was going to turn into a personal fight between Rand and Samael. The kind of fight that might kill everything within 2 or 3 miles. That's if I don't get a spear through the brisket first. And no more choice about it than had a goose hanging outside the kitchen door. None of it would be so without Couladin. A pity no one had killed the man years ago. He certainly gave excuses enough. Aiel seldom let anger show, and when they did, it was cold and tight. Couladin, on the other hand, seemed to flare up 2 or 3 times a day, losing his head in a fiery rage as quick as snap a straw. A miracle he was still alive, and the Dark One's own luck. "Nelicion," Mat said angrily, "swing your tyrants wide to the north and come in on these fellows from behind. We will be holding their attention, so you ride hard and come down like a barn collapsing." So he has the Dark One's luck, does he? Blood and ashes, but I hope mine is back in. "Talmanis, you do the same to the south. Move, both of you. We've little time and it's wasting." The 2 tyrants bowed hastily and dashed for their horses, clapping on their helmets. Talmanis's bow was more formal. "Grace, favor your sword, Mat. Or perhaps I should say your spear." Then he was gone too. Looking up at Mat as the 3 vanished down the hill, Derred slashed rain from his eyes with a finger. "So you will stay with the pikes this time. You must not let your anger at this Couladin overcome you. A battle is no place to try fighting a duel." Mat barely stopped from gaping. A duel? Him? With Couladin? Was that why Derred thought he was staying with the foot? He had chosen it because it was safer to be behind the pikes. That was his reason. The whole reason. "Not to worry. I can hold myself in rain." And he had thought Derred the most sensible of the whole lot. The Cairhien merely nodded. "I thought that you could. You have seen pikes pushed before and faced a charge or 2, I vow. Talmanis gives praises when there are 2 moons. Yet I heard him say aloud that he would follow wherever you led. Someday I would like to hear your story, Anderman. But you are young. Under the light, I mean no disrespect. And young men have hot blood." "This rain will keep it cool if nothing else does." Blood and ashes. Were they all mad? Talmanis was praising him? He wondered what they would say if they found out he was only a gambler following bits of memory from men dead 1,000 years and more. They would be drawing lots for first chance to spit him like a pig. The lords especially. No one liked being made to look a fool, but nobles seemed to like it least of all, perhaps because they so often managed it on their own. Well, one way or another, he meant to be miles away when that discovery came. Bloody Couladin. I'd like to shove my spear down his throat. Healing pips, he started for the opposite slope, where the foot waited below. Derred climbed into his own saddle and swung in beside him, nodding as Mat spun out his plan. The bowmen on the slopes, where they could cover the flanks, but lying down, hidden in the brush until the last minute. One man on the crest to signal the Aiel in sight, and the pikes to step off as soon as he did, marching straight out toward the approaching enemy. As soon as we can see the Shaido, we'll retreat just as fast as we can, almost back to the gap between these 2 hills, then turn to face them. They will think we wanted to run, realized we could not, and turned at bay like a bear to the hounds. Seeing us less than half their number and fighting only because we must, they should think to roll over us. Can we but hold their attention until the horse comes down on them from behind. The Cairhien actually grinned. It is using the Aiel's own tactics against them. We had better hold their bloody attention. Mat's tone was as dry as he was wet. To make sure we do, to make sure they don't start putting loops around our flanks, I want a cry raised as soon as you stop the retreat. Protect the Lord Dragon. This time, Derred laughed aloud. That should bring the Shaido in right enough, especially if Couladin was leading. If Couladin really was leading, if he thought Rand was with the pikes, if the pikes could hold until the horse arrived. A lot of ifs. Mat could hear those dice rolling in his head again. This was the biggest gamble he had ever taken in his life. He wondered how long it was until nightfall. A man should be able to make his way out in the night. he wished those dice would get out of his head or else fall, so he knew what they showed. Scowling into the rain, he booted Pips on down the hillside. Sitting on a small boulder jutting from the foot of the slope, Matt winced as he pulled his broad-brimmed hat lower against the mid-morning sun, partly to shield his eyes from the sun. There was another thing he did not want to see, though cuts and bruises reminded him, especially the arrow slash along his temple that the hat pressed against. An ointment from Darred's saddlebags had stopped the bleeding, there and elsewhere, yet everything still hurt, and most of it stung. That part would grow worse. The heat of the day was just beginning to take hold, but sweat was beating up on his face and already dampening his small clothes and shirt. Idly, he wondered whether autumn would ever come to Cairhien. At least discomfort kept him from thinking how tired he was. Even after a night with no sleep, he would have lain awake in a feather bed, much less blankets on the ground. Not that he wanted to be anywhere near his tent in any case. A fine, bloody to-do. Nearly killed. I'm sweating like a pig. I can't find a comfortable place to stretch out. And I don't dare get drunk. Blood and bloody ashes. He stopped fingering a slice across the chest of his coat. An inch difference, and that spear would have gone through his heart. Light, but the man had been good, and put that part of it out of his mind. Not that it was easy, with what was going on all around him. For once, the Tyrans in Cairhien did not seem to mind seeing Aiel tents in every direction. There were even Aiel right in the camp, and almost as miraculously, Tyrans mingling with Cairhien among the smoky cook fires. Not that anyone was eating. The kettles had not been set on the fires, although he could smell meat burning somewhere. Instead, most were as drunk as they could manage on wine, brandy, or Aiel usquai, laughing and celebrating. Not far from where he sat, a dozen defenders of the stone, stripped to sweaty shirt sleeves, were dancing to the claps of 10 times as many watchers. In a line, with arms around each other's shoulders, they stepped so quickly that it was a wonder none of them tripped or kicked the man next to them. For another circle of onlookers near a 10-foot pole stuck in the ground, Matt hastily averted his eyes, as many Aielmen were doing some kicking of their own. Matt assumed it was a dance. Another Aiel was playing the pipes for them. They leaped as high as they could, flung one foot even higher, then landed on that foot, and immediately leaped upward again, faster and faster, sometimes spinning like horizontal tops at the height of their leaps, or turning somersaults or backflips. 7 or 8 Tyrans in Cairhien sat nursing broken bones from trying it, all the while cheering and laughing like madmen, passing a stone crock of something back and forth. In other places, other men were dancing and maybe singing. It was hard to say in the din. Without stirring, he could count 10 flutes, not to mention twice as many tin whistles, and a skinny Cairhien in a ragged coat was blowing something that looked part flute and part horn with some odd bits tossed in. And there were countless drums, most of them pots being banged with spoons. In short, the camp was bedlam and a ball rolled into one. He recognized it, mainly from those memories he could still assign to other men if he concentrated hard enough. A celebration of still being alive. One more time they had walked under the Dark One's nose and survived to tell the tale. One more dance along the razor's edge finished. Almost dead yesterday, maybe dead tomorrow, but alive, gloriously alive today. He did not feel like celebrating. What good was being alive if it meant living in a cage? He shook his head as Darred, Estienne, and a heavy-set red-haired Aielman he did not know staggered by, holding each other up. Barely audible through the clamor, Darred and Estienne were trying to teach the taller man between them the words to Dance with Jack of the Shadows. We'll sing all night and drink all day, and on the girls we'll spend our pay, and when it's gone, then we'll away to dance with Jack of the Shadows. The sun-dark fellow showed no interest in learning, of course. He would not unless they convinced him it was a proper battle hymn. But he listened, and he was not the only one. By the time the three passed out of sight in the milling crowd, they had acquired a tale of 20 more, waving dented pewter cups and tarred leather mugs, all bellowing the tune at the top of their lungs. There are some delight in ale and wine, and some in girls with ankles fine. But my delight, yes, always mine, is to dance with Jack of the Shadows. Matt wished he had never taught any of them the song. The teaching had just kept his mind occupied while Dare had stopped him from bleeding to death. That ointment stung as bad as the gashes themselves had, and Darrett would never make a seamstress jealous with his delicate handling of needle and thread. Only the song had spread from that first dozen like fire in dry grass. Tyrans and Cairhien, horse and foot, had all been singing it when they returned at dawn. Returned. Right back to the hill valley where they had started, below the ruin of the log tower, and no chance for him to get away. He had offered to ride ahead, and Talmanas and Elysion nearly came to blows over who was to provide his escort. Not everyone had become the best of friends. All he needed now was for Moraine to come asking questions about where he had been and why, nattering at him about Taviran and duty, about the pattern and Tarmangaden until his head spun. Doubtless she was with Rand now, but she would get around to him eventually. He glanced up at the hilltop and the tangle of shattered logs among broken trees. That Cairhien fellow who made the looking glasses for Rand was up there with his apprentices poking about. The Aiel had been full of what happened there. It was definitely past time for him to be gone. The Foxhead medallion protected him from women channeling, but he had heard enough from Rand to know a man's channeling was different. He had no interest in finding out whether the thing would shield him from Samael and his ilk. Grimacing at darts of pain, he used the black-hafted spear to lever himself to his feet. Around him, the celebration went on. If he drifted down to the picket lines now, he was not looking forward to saddling Pips. The hero should not sit without drinking. Startled, he jerked around, grunting at the stab of his wounds, to stare at Malindra. She had a large clay pitcher in one hand, not spears, and her face was not veiled, but her eyes seemed to be weighing him. "Now listen, Malindra, I can explain everything." "What must be explained?" she asked, flinging her free arm around his shoulders. Even with the sudden jolt, he tried to stand straighter. He still was not used to having to look up at a woman. "I knew you would seek your own honor. The Cairhien casts a great shadow, but no man wishes to spend his life in the shade." Closing his mouth hurriedly, he managed a faint, "Of course." She was not going to try to kill him. "That's it exactly." In his relief, he took the pitcher from her, but his gulp turned into a sputter. It was the rawest double-distilled brandy he had ever tasted. She retrieved the pitcher long enough to take a draw, then sighed gratefully and pushed it back at him. "He was a man of much honor, Matrim Cauthon. Better that you had captured him, but even by killing him, you have gained much G. It was well that you sought him out." Despite himself, Matt looked at what he had been avoiding and shivered. A leather cord tied in short, flame-red hair held Couladin's head atop the 10-foot pole, near where the Aielmen were dancing. The thing seemed to be grinning. At him. Sought Couladin out. He had done his best to keep the pikes between him and any of the Shaido. But that arrow had clipped the side of his head, and he was on the ground before he knew it, struggling to get his feet, with the fight raging all around him, laying about him with the raven-marked spear, trying to make it back to Pips. Couladin had appeared as if springing out of air, veiled for killing, but there had been no mistaking those bare arms entwined with dragons glittering gold and red. The man had been cutting a swath into the pikemen with his spears, shouting for Rand to show himself, shouting that he was the true Cairhien. Maybe he really believed it by then. Matt still did not know whether Couladin had recognized him, But it made no difference, not when the fellow decided to carve a hole through him to find Rand. He did not know who had cut off Couladin's head afterward, either. I was too busy trying to stay alive to watch, he thought sourly, and hoping he would not bleed to death. Back in the Two Rivers, he had been as fine a hand with a quarterstaff as anyone, and a quarterstaff was not so different from a spear. But Couladin must have been born with the things in his hands. Of course, that skill had not availed the man much in the end. Maybe I still have a little bit of luck. Please, light, let it show itself now. He was thinking of how to get rid of Malindra so he could saddle Pips, when Talmanis presented himself with a formal bow, hand to heart in the Cairhien fashion. "Grace favor you, Matt." "And you," Matt said absently. She was not going to go because he asked. Asking would certainly put a fox in the hen yard. Maybe if he told her he wanted to take a ride. They said Aiel could run down horses. A delegation came from the city during the night. There will be a triumphal procession for the Lord Dragon in gratitude from Cairhien. Will there? She had to have duties of some sort. The maidens were always flocking around Rand. Maybe she would be called off for that. Glancing at her, though, he did not think he had better count on it. Her wide smile was proprietary. The delegation was from the High Lord Mylan, Nalisian said, joining them. His bow was just as correct, both hands sweeping wide but hasty. "It is he who offers the procession to the Lord Dragon. Lord Dobrain, Lord Marengil, and Lady Colaver, among others, also came to the Lord Dragon." Matt pulled his mind back to the moment. Each of the pair was trying to pretend the other of them did not exist, both looking right at him, with never the flicker of an eye toward each other. But their faces were as tight as their voices from the strain, their hands white-knuckled on sword hilts. It would be a cap to everything if they came to blows, and him likely still trying to hobble out of reach when one of them ran him through by accident. What does it matter who sent a delegation as long as Rand gets his procession? "It matters that you should ask him for our rightful place at the head," Talmanis said quickly. "You slew Couladin and earned us that place." Nalisian closed his mouth and scowled. Plainly, he had been about to say the same thing. "You two ask him," Matt said. "It's none of my affair." Malindra's hand tightened on the back of his neck, but he did not care. Moraine would surely not be far from Rand. He was not about to put his neck in a second noose, while still trying to think his way out of the first. Talmanis and Nalisian gaped at him as if he were demented. "You are our battle leader," Nalisian protested. "Our general." "My body servant will polish your boots," Talmanis put in with a small smile that he carefully did not direct at the square-faced Tyran. "And brush and mend your clothes, so you will appear at your best." Nalisian gave his oiled beard a jerk. His eyes darted halfway to the other man before he could stop them. "If I may offer, I have a good coat I think will fit you well. Gold, satin, and crimson." It was the Cairhien's turn to glower. "General!" Matt exclaimed, holding himself up with the spear haft. "I'm no flaming... I wouldn't want to usurp your place." Let them figure out which one of them he meant. "Burn my soul," Nalisian said. "It was your battle skill that won for us and kept us alive, not to mention your luck. I've heard how you always turn the right card, but it is more than that. I'd follow you if you had never met the Lord Dragon." "You are our leader," Talmanis said right on top of him, in a voice more somber, if no less certain. "Until yesterday I have followed men of other lands because I must. You I will follow because I want to. Perhaps you are not a lord in Andor, but here I say that you are. And I pledge myself your man." Cairhien and Tyran stared at one another as though startled at voicing the same sentiment, then slowly, reluctantly, exchanged brief nods. If they did not like each other, and only a fool would bet against that, they could meet on this point, after a fashion. "I will send my groom to prepare your horse for the procession," Talmanis said, and barely frowned when Nalisian added, "Mine can share the work. Your mount must do us proud. And burn my soul, we need a banner. Your banner. At that, the Cairhien nodded emphatically. Matt was not sure whether to laugh hysterically or sit down and cry. Those bloody memories. If not for them, he would have ridden on. If not for Rand, he would not have the things. He could trace the steps that led to them, each necessary as it seemed at the time, and seeming an end in itself, yet each leading inevitably to the next. At the beginning of it all lay Rand, and bloody Taviran. He could not understand why doing something that seemed absolutely necessary and as close to harmless as he could make it always seemed to lead him deeper into the mire. Malindra had begun stroking the back of his neck instead of squeezing it. All he needed now, he glanced at the hill, and there she was. Moraine, on her delicate-stepping white mare, with Lan on his black stallion towering at her side. The warder bent toward her as if to listen, and there seemed to be a brief argument, a violent protest on his part, but after a moment the Aes Sedai reined Aldib around and rode out of sight toward the opposite slope. Lan remained where he was on Mondarb, watching the camp below, watching Matt. He shivered. Couladin's head really did appear to be grinning at him. He could almost hear the man speak. "You may have killed me, but you've put your foot squarely in the trap. I'm dead, but you'll never be free." "Just bloody wonderful," he muttered, and took a long, choking swallow of the rough brandy. Talmanis and Elysion seemed to think he meant it as said, and Malindra laughed agreement. Some 50 or so Tyrans in Cairhien had gathered to watch the two lords speak to him, and they took his drinking as a signal to serenade him, beginning with a verse of their own. "We'll toss the dice however they fall, and snuggle the girls, be they short or tall. Then follow young Matt whenever he calls, to dance with Jack of the Shadows." With a wheezing laugh he could not stop, Matt sank back down onto the boulder and set about emptying the pitcher. There had to be some way out of this. There just had to be.
We'll drink the wine till cock is dry, and kiss the girls so they'll not cry, and toss the dice until we fly, then dance with Jack of the Shadows. We'll dance all night till the moon runs free, and dandle the lasses upon our knee, and then you'll ride along with me to dance with Jack of the Shadows. Snuggle the girls, be they short or tall, and follow Lord Matt. It could be worse as we ride away with the dark ones first, to dance with Jack of the Shadows.
A rap came at the door, and Somara put her flaxen head into the room. "Matrim Cauthon has come, Cairhien. He says that you sent for him." 4 hours ago, as soon as he had learned Matt was back in the city. What would the excuse be this time? It was time to be done with excuses. "Stay," he told the women. Wise ones made Matt almost as uneasy as Aes Sedai did. These three would put him off balance. He did not give a second thought to using them. He was going to use Matt, too. "Send him in, Somara." Matt strolled into the room, grinning as if it was a common room. His green coat hung open, and his shirt was half unlaced, exposing the silver fox head dangling on his sweaty chest. But the dark silk scarf was draped around his neck to hide his hanging scar in spite of the heat. "Sorry I took too long. There were some Cairhien who thought they knew how to play cards." "Doesn't he know anything livelier?" he asked, jerking his head toward Osmodian. "I hear," Rand said, "that every young man who can pick up a sword wants to join the band of the Red Hand. Talmanis and Elysian are having to turn them away in droves, and Derred has doubled the number of his footmen." Matt paused in lowering himself into the chair Aracombe had used. "It's true. A fine lot of young fellows wanting to be heroes." "The band of the Red Hand," Moraine murmured. "Shen an Kalhar. A legendary group of heroes indeed, though the men in it must have changed many times in a war that lasted well over 300 years. It is said they were the last to fall to the Trollocs, guarding Aemon himself when Manetheren died. Legend says a spring rose where they fell, to mark their passing. But I rather think the spring was already there." "I wouldn't know about that." Matt touched the foxhead medallion, and his voice picked up strength. "Some fool got the name from somewhere, and they all started using it." Moraine glanced at the medallion dismissively. The small blue stone hanging on her forehead seemed to catch the light and glow, though the angles were wrong. "You are very brave, it seems, Matt." It was flatly said, and the silence that followed stiffened his face. "Very brave," she said finally. "To lead Shen an Kalhar across the Alguenya and south against the Andorans. Even braver than that, for there are rumors that you went alone to scout the way, and Talmanis and Elysian had to ride hard to catch up to you." Egwene sniffed loudly in the background. "Hardly wise for a young lord leading his men." Matt's lip curled. "I'm no lord. I've more respect for myself than that." "But very brave," Moraine said, as if he had not spoken. "Andoran supply wagons burned, outposts destroyed, and 3 battles. 3 battles and 3 victories, with small loss to your own men, though outnumbered." As she fingered a rip in the shoulder of his coat, he sank back as far as the chair would allow. "Are you drawn to the thick of battles, or are they drawn to you? I'm almost surprised you came back. To hear the stories, you might have driven the Andorans back across the Aranin had you stayed." "Do you think this is funny?" Matt snarled. "If you have something to say, say it. You can play the cat all you want, but I'm no mouse." For an instant his eyes flickered toward Egwene and Avienda, watching with folded arms, and he fingered the silver fox head again. He had to be wondering. It had stopped one woman's channeling from touching him. Would it stop 3? Rand only watched. Watched his friend being softened for what he meant to do to him. Is there anything left to me but necessity? It was a quick thought, there and gone. He would do what he must. The Aes Sedai's voice gained a rhyme of crystal frost as she spoke, almost in an echo. We all do as we must, as the pattern decrees. For some there is less freedom than for others. It does not matter whether we choose or are chosen. What must be, must be. Matt did not look softened at all. Wary, yes, and certainly angry, but not softened. He could have been a tomcat backed into a corner by 3 hounds. A tomcat who meant to go down hard. He seemed to have forgotten anyone was in the room except for himself and the 3 women. You always have to push a man where you want him, don't you? Kick him there if he won't go led by the nose. Blood and bloody ashes. Matt strode through the dimly lit corridors of the palace and flung open the door of the rooms that had been set aside for the young hero of the battle against the Shaido. Not that he had spent much time there. Hardly any. Servants had lit 2 of the stand lamps. Hero. He was no hero. What did a hero get? An Aes Sedai patting you on the head before she sent you out like a hound to do it again? A noblewoman condescending to favor you with a kiss or laying a flower on your grave? He stalked back and forth in his anteroom, for once not pricing the flowered Ilianer carpet or the chairs and chests and tables gilded and inlaid with ivory. The stormy meeting with Rand had gone on till the sun set, him dodging, refusing, Rand following as doggedly as Hawkwing after the rout at Cole Pass. What was he to do? If he rode out again, Talmanis and Elysion would surely follow with as many men as they could put in the saddle, expecting him to find another battle. And he probably would. That was what really put a chill on it. Much as he hated to admit it, the Aes Sedai was right. He was drawn to battle, or it to him. Nobody could have tried harder to avoid one on the other side of the Alguenia. Even Talmanis had commented on it. Until the second time his careful creeping away from one lot of Andorans took them where there was no choice but to fight another. And every time he could feel the dice rolling in his head. It was almost like a warning that a fight was just over the next hill now. There was always a ship, or might be, down at the docks beside the grain barges. Hard to find yourself in a battle on a ship in the middle of a river, except the Andorans held one bank of the Alguenia for half its length or more below the city. The way his luck was running, the ship would run aground in the west bank with half the Andoran army camped there. That left doing what Rand wanted. He could just see it. Good morrow, High Lord Wyraman and all you other High Lords and ladies. I'm a gambler, a farm boy, and I'm here to take command of your bloody army. The bloody Lord Dragon Reborn will be with us as soon as he flaming takes care of one bloody little matter. Snatching his black-hafted spear from the corner, he hurled it the length of the room. It struck a wall hanging, a hunting scene, and the stone wall behind, with a loud clang, then dropped to the floor, leaving the hunters neatly sliced in 2. Swearing, he hurried to pick it up. The 2-foot sword blade was not chipped or marred. Of course not. Aes Sedai work. He fingered the ravens on the blade. Will I ever be free of Aes Sedai work? What was that? Malindra asked from the door. He eyed her as he propped the spear against the wall, and for a change it was not spun gold hair or clear blue eyes or a firm body that he thought of. It seemed that every Aiel went to the river sooner or later to stare silently at so much water in one place, but Malindra went every day, just about. Has Qadir found ships yet? Qadir would not be going to Tar Valon on grain barges. The peddlers' wagons are still there. I do not know about ships. She pronounced the unfamiliar word awkwardly. Why do you wish to know? I'm going away for a while. For Rand, he added hastily. Her face was too still. I'd take you with me if I could, but you wouldn't want to leave the maidens. A ship or his own horse? And to where? That was the question. He could reach Tyr quicker on a fast river ship than on Pip's, if he was fool enough to make that choice. If he had any choice. Malindra's mouth tightened briefly. To his surprise, it was not over his leaving her. So you slip back into Randolph or Shaido. You have gained much honor of your own, among the Aiel as well as the Wetlanders. Your honor, not honor reflected from the Cairhien. He can keep his honor and take it to Cairhien or the Pit of Doom for all I care. Don't you worry, I'll find plenty of honor. I'll write you all about it. From Tyr. Tyr? He would never escape Rand or Aes Sedai if he made that choice. He is going to Cairhien? Matt suppressed a wince. He was not supposed to say anything about that. Whatever he decided about the rest, he could do that much. Just a name pulled from my pocket. Because of the Andorans down south, I suppose. I wouldn't know where he's... He had no warning. One instant, she was just standing there. The next, her foot was in his middle, driving out breath, doubling him over. Eyes bulging, he fought to keep his feet, to straighten, to think. Why? She spun like a dancer, backwards, and her other foot against the side of his head drove him staggering. Without a pause, she leaped straight up, kicking out, her soft boot sole taking him hard flush in the face. When his eyes cleared enough to see, he was on his back, halfway across the room from her. He could feel blood on his face. His head seemed stuffed with wool, and the room seemed to rock. That was when he saw her take a knife from her pouch, slim blade not much longer than her hand, gleaming in the lamplight. Winding the shuffa around her head in a quick motion, she raised the black veil across her face. Groggily, he moved by instinct without thinking. The blade came out of his sleeve, left his hand as if floating through jelly. Only then did he realize what he had done and stretch out desperately, trying to snatch it back. The hilt bloomed between her breasts. She sagged to her knees, fell back. Matt pushed himself up, wavering on hands and knees. He could not have stood if his life hung on it. But he crawled to her, muttering wildly, "Why? Why?" He jerked her veil aside, and those clear blue eyes focused on him. She even smiled. He did not look at the knife hilt. His knife hilt. He knew where the heart was in a body. "Why, Malindra?" "I always liked your pretty eyes," she breathed, so faint he had to strain to hear. "Why?" "Some oaths are more important than others, Matrim Cauthon." The slim-bladed knife came up swiftly, all her remaining strength behind it, the point driving the dangling fox head against his chest. The silver medallion should not have stopped a blade, but the angle was just that much wrong, and some hidden flaw in the steel snapped the blade off right at the hilt, just as he caught her hand. "You have the great lord's own luck." "Why?" he demanded. "Burn you, why?" He knew there would be no answer. Her mouth remained open, as though she might say something more, but her eyes were already beginning to glaze. He started to pull the veil back up, to cover her face and staring eyes, then let his hand fall. He had killed men and Trollocs, but never a woman. Never a woman until now. Women were glad when he came into their lives. It was not boasting. Women smiled for him. Even when he left them, they smiled as if they would welcome him back. That was all he ever really wanted from women. A smile, a dance, a kiss, and to be remembered fondly. He realized his thoughts were babbling. Jerking the bladeless hilt from Malindra's hand, it was gold-mounted jade inlaid with golden bees. He hurled it into the marble fireplace, hoping it shattered. He wanted to cry, to howl. "I don't kill women. I kiss them. I don't..." He had to think clearly. Why? Not because he was leaving, surely. She had hardly reacted to that. Besides, she thought he was chasing off after honor. She'd always approved of that. Something she had said tugged at him and then came back with a chill. The great lord's own luck. He had heard it differently many times. The Dark One's own luck. A dark friend. A question or certainty? He wished the thought made what he had done easier in his mind. He was going to carry her face to his grave. Tyr. He had as much as told her he was going to Tyr. The dagger. Golden bees in jade. He would wager there were 9 without looking. 9 golden bees on a field of green. The sign of Ilion, where Samael ruled. Could Samael be afraid of him? Could Samael even know? It was only a few hours since Rand had asked Matt, told him, and he was not sure himself what he was going to do. Maybe Samael would not take the chance? Right. One of the Forsaken, afraid of a gambler, however stuffed with other men's battle knowledge his head might be. That was ridiculous. It all came down to this. He could believe that Malindra had not been a dark friend, that she had decided to kill him on a whim, that there was no connection between a jade hilt inlaid with golden bees and his maybe going to Tyr to lead an army against Ilion. He could, if he was a bull-goose fool. Better to err toward caution, he always said. One of the Forsaken had noticed him. He certainly was not standing in Rand's shadow now. Sliding across the floor, he sat with his chin on his knees and his back against the door, staring at Malindra's face, trying to decide what to do. When a servant knocked with his supper, he shouted for her to go away. Food was the last thing he wanted. What was he going to do? He wished he did not feel the dice spinning in his head.
We'll drink the wine till the cup is dry. Kiss the girls so they'll not cry. Toss the dice until we fly. To dance with Jacko the shadows. We'll sing all night and drink all day, and on the girls we'll spend our pay. And when it's gone, then we'll away to dance with Jacko the shadows. We'll dance all night till the moon runs free, and end all the lasses upon our knee. And then you'll ride along with me to dance with Jacko the shadows. There's some delight in ale and wine, some in girls with ankles fine. But my delight, yes, always mine, is to dance with Jacko the shadows. We'll toss the dice however they fall. And snuggle the girls, be they short or tall, and follow Lord Mac